The ice on Black Pine Lake did not crack. It groaned, like something alive was dying beneath it. Mara Ellison ran toward the sound with a rope in her hands and terror in her chest, because somewhere under that black water, puppies were screaming. She saved 3 tiny lives that night. Then she saw the hand of a man trapped beneath the sinking glass. By the time she dragged him onto the snow and found the bullet wound in his side, Mara had already pulled the Mafia into her living room. This is the story of the night a single mother's kindness collided with a war she never asked to join. The storm had been building since noon, rolling down from Canada in gray sheets that swallowed the tree line. By 9 o'clock, Black Pine Lake was a flat black mirror under 6 inches of fresh snow, and the wind screamed through the pines like something with teeth. Inside the cabin, Mara Ellison stood at the kitchen counter with a piece of paper in her hand that she had read 4 times already, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something kinder. They never did. An order of intent to foreclose. She folded it once, then again, until it was small enough to disappear into the drawer with the others. Her hands were still faintly stained with iodine from the Hendricks farm that afternoon, where she'd spent 3 hours pulling a calf breech and getting paid in venison and a promise. Promises didn't cover a mortgage. Nothing about this life covered much of anything, but it was hers and it was Ivy's, and that had to be enough. She climbed the narrow stairs and pushed open her daughter's door. Ivy Ellison, 6 years old, lay curled beneath a quilt covered in painted foxes, her breathing soft and even for now. Mara touched 2 fingers to her daughter's forehead the way she'd done every night since Ivy was born. An old nurse's habit that never faded even after the world took her nursing license away. No fever, no wheeze yet. "Good. Sleep tight, baby," she whispered, and closed the door. She was halfway down the stairs when she heard it. At first she told herself it was the wind or a loose shutter or her own exhausted mind inventing sounds. But it came again, high, thin, desperate. Not one voice, several. Crying. Mara froze on the bottom step, every nerve in her body snapping awake. She had spent 6 years listening to animals in pain, learning the difference between a fox's bark and a dog's whimper and a child's scream. This was none of those and all of them at once. She grabbed her coat, her boots, the coil of rope hanging by the door that her father had used for ice fishing decades ago, and she ran. The wind hit her like a wall the moment she stepped outside, snow needling into her face, but she didn't slow down. The sound was coming from the lake, from the black water past the tree line where no boat should have been, where nothing should have been. Not in a storm like this, not in February. When she broke through the last line of pines, she saw it. A car, no, an SUV, black and heavy and expensive in a way that didn't belong anywhere near Black Pine Lake, was nose down in a ragged wound in the ice, sinking by degrees, its rear tires still spinning uselessly against nothing. The ice around it groaned and split further even as she watched, black water lapping up over broken shelves like something feeding, and from inside, through a half-open rear window, came the crying. Puppies. 3 of them, she would learn, though in that moment all she understood was that something small and helpless was drowning 20 feet from where she stood. "Hold on," she screamed, and her voice was torn away by the wind before it reached anything. She tied the rope to a fence post near the shore, looped the other end around her waist with fingers already numbing, and went down onto the ice on her stomach, spreading her weight the way her father taught her before she could walk properly on land. The ice screeched beneath her, complaining, threatening. "Come on," she muttered. "Come on, come on." She reached the window. The SUV had tilted, its rear end still above the surface, the front already swallowed. Icy water sloshed against the door as she wrenched it open, and the smell of gasoline and blood hit her before anything else. The first puppy was easy to find, shivering against the seat, small enough to fit in one hand. She scooped it up and shoved it inside her coat against her chest, feeling its whole tiny body convulsing with cold. The second was tangled in a seatbelt that had somehow wrapped around its back leg. She had to work her frozen fingers under the strap, cursing, until it came free and she pulled it, howling, into her other arm. The third was silent. She found it floating, half submerged in the rising water pooling in the footwell, limp as a wet rag. Mara's training took over before her fear could. She laid the puppy on the seat, tilted its small skull back, and pressed 2 fingers against its tiny chest in quick, careful compressions, counting under her breath the way she'd counted over human chests 100 times in a Chicago R that no longer wanted her. "Don't you do this," she hissed. "Don't you dare." The puppy convulsed, coughed up a thin stream of lake water, and gasped a ragged breath. Mara nearly sobbed with relief. She shoved it into her coat with the others. 3 small heartbeats hammering against her ribs, and began to pull herself back toward the rope. That was when she saw the hand. It slapped against the inside of the rear windshield, weak, sliding, human, and disappeared beneath the water rising inside the cabin of the SUV. Mara's whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. No, she said, no. She didn't think. She didn't calculate the odds or the ice, or the fact that she had 3 shivering lives already tucked against her heart, and a daughter sleeping half a mile away who needed her mother to come home. She dove back through the window into black water that stopped her breath in her lungs like a fist closing around her throat. Her hands found fabric, a coat, heavy and soaked, and beneath it, a body far too large for her to move easily. She hauled with everything she had, every muscle screaming, lungs burning, until she broke the surface with a gasp that tore at her throat, dragging a dead weight of a man half out of the sinking vehicle. The ice groaned again, a long fracturing note, and the SUV lurched another foot into the black water. Move, 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 Mara chanted to herself, pulling the rope taut, hauling the man's shoulders across the broken ice shelf inch by inch, while the puppies cried against her chest and the storm screamed overhead, and somewhere behind her, the last of the vehicle's lights sank into the dark and went out. By the time she dragged him onto solid snow at the shoreline, her arms had gone past pain into a strange, trembling numbness. She rolled him onto his back, snow settling instantly on his colorless face, and pressed her fingers to his throat. A pulse. Faint, but there. She tore his coat open to check for injury, expecting bruising from the crash. Her hand came away warm and red. A bullet wound, just below his ribs, dark and seeping even in the freezing water that should have slowed everything, including his blood. Mara knelt there in the snow with 3 half-drowned puppies shivering against her heart and a bleeding stranger dying beneath her hands. And she understood, with a clarity that cut through even the cold, that whatever had happened on this lake tonight had not been an accident. There was no ambulance coming. Not tonight. Not through 6 inches of snow and a downed line and a road that hadn't seen a plow since the storm started. Mara knew this before she even tried the landline in the mudroom and got nothing but a dead hiss. She had gotten him onto the old wood sled she used for hauling firewood, and it had taken every remaining ounce of strength in her body to drag him the quarter-mile back to the cabin. Rope biting into her shoulder, the 3 puppies riding in a canvas sling against her chest the whole way, crying weakly into the storm. By the time she got him through the door and onto the braided rug in front of the fireplace, her arms were shaking too hard to unbutton her own coat. She fed the fire until it roared, laid the puppies in a nest of towels close enough to warm but not burn, and turned to the man. He was big, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, somewhere in his late 30s, with a jaw set even in unconsciousness and the kind of stillness that made her think, absurdly, of a wolf sleeping rather than a man drowning. His skin had gone the pale blue-gray of deep hypothermia. His lips were nearly white. "Okay," she said aloud, to no one the way she'd learned to talk herself through crises a decade ago in Chicago. "Okay, hypothermia first. Bullet second. Priorities Mara." She cut his soaked clothes away with the kitchen shears, working fast, layering heated blankets she'd warmed by the fire, sliding hot water bottles and bricks wrapped in towels against his torso and throat and groin. Every trick the old ER nurses had taught her for pulling a body back from the edge of the cold. His breathing was shallow. Twice it seemed to stop entirely, and twice Mara pressed her palm flat against his sternum and murmured, "Not on my floor, you don't," until it resumed, ragged but present. Only when his color began to shift from blue toward something closer to human did she turn her attention to the wound. It was a through and through, mercifully. The bullet had entered below the ribs and lodged shallow, likely deflected by something, maybe the car seat, maybe pure luck. She had no surgical suite, no anesthesia, no second nurse handing her instruments. She had her veterinary field kit, a bottle of vodka for sterilizing, sewing thread boiled clean, and forceps she usually used on farm animals twice this man's size. "This is going to hurt," she told him, though he couldn't hear her. "I'm sorry." She worked by firelight and lantern, sterilizing the forceps in the flame until they glowed faintly orange, then cooling them in the vodka before easing them into the wound. His body arched off the rug the instant metal touched flesh, a raw animal sound tearing out of his throat, and his hand shot out and closed around her wrist with a grip that could have cracked bone. Mara didn't pull away. "You can hold on to me if you need to," she said, low and steady, the voice she used on frightened animals and frightened children alike. "But I am not stopping." His fingers dug in harder. His eyes opened for one fractured second, dark, unfocused, full of pain and something older than pain. And he said something in a language she didn't recognize, low and broken, before his head fell back and his grip loosened into unconsciousness again. She found the bullet a few minutes later, small and misshapen, and dropped it with a metallic clink into a steel bowl. She flushed the wound with saline, packed it, and began to stitch, her hands moving on old memory that had nothing to do with the years of paperwork and lawsuits and closed doors that had followed her out of that Chicago hospital. Her hands remembered how to save a life even when the rest of the world had told her she wasn't allowed to anymore. When she finally sat back on her heels, hours had passed. The storm still howled outside. The fire had burned low twice, and she'd fed it twice more. The puppies had stopped shivering and now slept in a warm, twitching pile of paws and soft bellies. The man breathed, steadier now, alive. Mara looked down at her bloodied, iodine-stained hands, at the stranger wrapped in her late father's quilts, at the gun-shaped bulge she had felt and deliberately not examined when she cut away his coat. And she thought, not for the first time in her life, what have I just brought into my house? She didn't sleep. She sat in the old rocking chair by the fire with a mug of black coffee gone cold in her hands, watching the stranger's chest rise and fall, and let her mind drift backward the way it always did in the small hours, to Chicago, to the version of herself that still believed doing the right thing was simply what you did. She had been an ER nurse for 6 years at Lakeshore Memorial. Good at it. Fast, calm under pressure, the nurse other nurses wanted on a bad shift. She'd loved it in a way she didn't know how to explain to people who hadn't stood over a gurney at 3 in the morning, holding someone's hand while they waited to find out if they would live. Then came the night Dr. Whitfield made a mistake that killed a 19-year-old boy named Casey Ruiz. A medication error, entirely preventable, entirely covered up within an hour by a hospital that valued Whitfield's donor family connections more than a dead kid from the South Side. Mara had the chart. She had the timestamps. She had, God help her, a conscience that wouldn't let it go. She reported it. She testified. And the hospital, rather than admit fault, buried her instead, quietly stripping her of shifts, then her standing, then, through a campaign of manufactured complaints and a board too cowardly to look too closely, her license itself. Whitfield kept practicing for another 18 months before a second incident finally caught up with him. By then, Mara had lost her career, her savings to legal fees, and most of her friends, who found it easier to believe the hospital's story than hers. She'd taken Ivy, 3 years old then, already showing the first signs of the asthma that would follow her, and driven east until the roads ran out, until she found a cabin on a lake nobody wanted, cheap enough to buy with what was left, remote enough that nobody there cared what a Chicago licensing board said about her. She'd become a traveling vet instead. Nobody revoked your license to save a cow. Nobody's family owned the county large enough to bury a whistleblowing nurse who now spent her days pulling calves and stitching farm dogs. It was smaller work. It was still saving lives. It was, some nights, the only thing that made her feel like the person she used to be. Now she looked at the stranger on her rug, clearly wealthy, clearly dangerous, clearly the kind of man whose enemies shot him and put him through the ice rather than simply letting him die of natural causes. And she felt the old fear rise in her chest, sharper than the cold ever was. If this goes wrong, it isn't just me who pays for it. It's Ivy. She had already lost everything once for doing the right thing. She could survive losing it again. She was not at all sure she could survive it costing her daughter anything at all. She looked at the puppies breathing steadily in their nest of towels, at the man's face slack with exhausted sleep, and she made herself a promise in the dark. Whatever this is, whoever he is, my daughter comes first. Always, no matter what walks through that door next. It was nearly 3 in the morning when the barking started. Mara had finally allowed herself to doze in the rocking chair, coffee cold beside her, when all 3 puppies erupted at once. Sharp, frantic, insistent barks aimed not at the door, not at the windows, but up the stairs, toward Ivy's room. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, some animal part of her brain already understanding what the sound meant before her conscious mind caught up. She took the stairs 2 at a time. Ivy was sitting up in bed, small hands clutched at her own chest, her breath coming in high, thin whistles that Mara had heard too many times not to recognize instantly. Winter asthma. The cold air, the dry wood stove heat, something had triggered it, and it was bad. Worse than the usual tightness, her daughter's lips already tinged faintly with the color that turned Mara's blood to ice. "Mommy," Ivy wheezed, eyes wide with fear. "Mommy, I can't. I'm here, baby. I'm right here." Mara's voice came out steady, though her heart was slamming. She had trained herself for this exact moment 100 times, had run drills with Ivy like games so the panic wouldn't win. She scooped her daughter into her lap, reached for the inhaler on the nightstand with a hand that did not shake even though every other part of her wanted to. Look at me. Eyes on Mommy. Ivy's terrified gaze locked onto hers. Good girl. We're going to breathe together, okay? In through the mouthpiece, nice and slow. She primed the inhaler, pressed it to Ivy's lips, counted the breath in, held, released. Ivy's small body was rigid with the effort of pulling air through airways that didn't want to open. One more, sweetheart. In, hold it. There you go. Downstairs, the puppies had not stopped. If anything, they grew louder, as if their barking itself were a kind of rhythm Mara's own counting fell into without meaning to. In, 2, 3, hold, 2, 3, out, 2, 3, the sound anchoring her, keeping her voice from cracking even as her daughter's small chest heaved against her. You're doing so good, Ivy. I'm so proud of you. Breathe with Mommy. Slowly, an eternity measured in seconds, the whistle in Ivy's breath began to loosen. The rigid line of her shoulders eased. Color crept back into her lips. By the fourth dose, timed exactly as Mara's training demanded, Ivy's breathing had settled into something ragged but manageable, and she slumped against her mother's chest, exhausted and trembling. There she is. Mara whispered into her daughter's hair, pressing her lips to the top of her head, finally letting her own hands shake now that the crisis had passed. There's my brave girl. She carried Ivy downstairs rather than leave her alone, settling her on the couch near the fire where she could watch her more closely, where the air was warmer and drier. The 3 puppies immediately abandoned their nest of towels and clambered, still unsteady on their own recovering legs, onto the couch and around Ivy's small body, curling against her sides and her feet like they had appointed themselves her guard. Ivy, half asleep already, smiled faintly and murmured, "They're warm." Mara sat on the edge of the couch and watched her daughter's chest rise and fall in easy, unlabored breaths, watched 3 tiny animals she had pulled from freezing black water an hour before now, standing sentry over the most precious thing in her world, and something in her chest cracked open with a feeling too large for the small hours of the night. She had saved them without asking what they were worth, and now, in the strangest, smallest way, they had just helped save her daughter's life in return. She glanced across the room at the stranger, still sleeping by the fire, wounded and dangerous and utterly unaware of what had just happened 3 feet from where he lay, and thought, everything in this house tonight is more connected than I want it to be. Dawn came gray and reluctant, the storm finally spending itself into a thin, steady snowfall. Mara had just gotten Ivy back into her own bed, exhausted but breathing easy, when she heard movement from the living room. The stranger was awake. He was sitting up against the stone hearth, one hand pressed to the bandaged wound at his side, and his eyes, when they found her in the doorway, swept the room with a speed and precision that had nothing sleepy or disoriented about it. He catalogued the windows, the door, the distance to her, the puppies now sleeping in their nest by the fire. All of it in under 2 seconds, the way a soldier reads a room or a predator reads a cage. You're in my house, Mara said, keeping her voice level, keeping the kitchen island between them without making it obvious that was what she was doing. Black Pine Lake, Maine. I pulled you and 3 puppies out of your car before it went under the ice. You had a bullet in your side. I took it out. His dark eyes settled on her, sharp despite the pain clearly radiating from his ribs. How long? 9 hours, give or take. He absorbed that, then looked down at the neat, careful stitches along his side, visible where the blanket had slipped. Something crossed his face that might have been surprise, quickly buried. You did this. I used to be a nurse. Now I'm a vet who occasionally gets to practice on people. She folded her arms. You're welcome, by the way. A ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile touched his mouth and vanished. Where is my coat? Drying by the stove, along with the gun I found in it, which is currently somewhere you are not going to find easily, and which we are going to talk about. His gaze sharpened further at that, calculating. But before he could answer, a faint electronic chirp sounded from the coat draped over the drying rack near the stove. He was on his feet before Mara could tell him not to move, swayed hard, caught himself on the mantel, and gritted through what must have been searing pain to cross the room. That's a satellite phone, Mara said, following alarmed. You shouldn't be. Give it to me. His voice had dropped into something colder, harder, an authority that didn't ask twice. Mara hesitated a beat, then pulled the small device from the coat pocket and handed it over, more out of triage instinct than obedience. He was going to hurt himself worse trying to grab it himself. He answered in a language Mara didn't recognize. Clipped, urgent, unmistakably a command even in a tongue she couldn't parse. She caught only fragments. A name, repeated twice. Roman, and once, low and rough, a word that sounded almost like relief. He lowered the phone. Someone is coming, 20 minutes. Someone who? Someone who works for me. 22 minutes later, headlights cut through the thinning snow outside, and a black sedan, far too clean and far too expensive for these roads, pulled up outside the cabin. A man got out, lean, precise, dressed like he'd stepped out of a boardroom rather than a snowstorm, and came through the door without knocking, scanning the room exactly the way the stranger had before dropping to one knee beside him. Mr. Draven. The relief in the man's voice was real, even beneath its careful control. We thought, I know what you thought. Draven's voice was dry. Victor thought the same. Mara went very still. Draven. She knew that name. Everyone in New England who read a newspaper knew that name. Ports under investigation for years without a single charge sticking. Warehouses full of things nobody could ever quite prove. Witnesses in 3 states who had a habit of disappearing before trial. Nikolai Draven. The name attached to headlines that always ended in question marks because nobody could ever answer them. She had pulled a mafia king out of a frozen lake and stitched him back together on her living room floor. You should have let the water finish its work, nurse, Draven said, watching her face change as the pieces fell into place. Now both of us are in trouble. The man who'd arrived, Roman Vale, as Draven introduced him, took up a position at the window, scanning the tree line with the stillness of someone who had done this before in far worse conditions. Mara stood in her own kitchen with her arms crossed, feeling the floor of her life tilt beneath her. Talk, she said. Now. All of it, or I put you back on that sled and let the lake finish what it started. Draven studied her for a long moment, as if weighing whether she deserved the truth or simply needed to be managed. Something in her face must have convinced him it would be the former either way, because he didn't try to lie. My cousin, he said. Victor. We were raised together. My father took him in when his own father drank himself into a grave. I gave him warehouses, routes, a seat at every table that mattered. His jaw tightened. 2 nights ago, he put a bullet in me and pushed my car through the ice himself. He wanted it to look like an accident, a grieving family, a tragic loss, a smooth transition of everything I built to a cousin who stepped up in his time of grief. Your family built this on shipping, Roman added quietly from the window, without turning. Ports, cold storage, legitimate on paper for 30 years before Victor's father corrupted half of it. Nikolai spent a decade trying to clean it from the inside without blowing the whole thing up around the workers who depend on it. Mara looked at Draven with new, wary calculation. And why would I believe any of that? You don't have to believe it, Draven said. You already saved my life without knowing any of it. I'm simply telling you what you've inherited by doing so. She was quiet a moment. Why did I save you? That's the question that's been eating at me since 3 this morning. Not because I regret it. I don't filter lives based on who deserves to breathe. Doesn't matter to me if it's a stray dog or the president. If something's alive and it's dying in front of me, I don't get to choose which lives are worth the effort. That's not how it works. That's not how I work. Something shifted in Draven's expression. Not quite softness, but a crack in the careful control he wore like armor. My sister asked a hospital for that same mercy once, he said, quiet now. We had nothing. My father hadn't yet built anything. She had a fever that turned into something worse, and the hospital in the town we lived in decided a family with no money and no insurance could wait. She died waiting. His eyes met Mara's, and for the first time she saw something almost human in them, old grief, worn smooth by years of being buried under something harder. That was the day I decided I would never again be a man that world could ignore. I built power because power is the only thing that stops people from deciding your life is worth less than someone else's. Mara felt something in her chest twist painfully, recognizing the shape of the wound even though the two of them had walked in opposite directions from the same kind of injury. I lost my career for exposing a doctor who let a patient die because covering it up was more convenient than admitting fault. I know exactly what it feels like when the system decides some lives don't matter enough to protect. They looked at each other across the kitchen. The whistleblower nurse who'd lost everything trying to save a life the system had already given up on, and the mafia king who'd built an empire out of refusing to ever be powerless again. And for one long moment, neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound too much like recognition. It was the coat that broke the strange quiet between them. Mara had gone to hang it properly once it dried, and her hand closed around the hard shape of the gun still tucked in its inner pocket. She pulled it out and set it on the counter with more force than necessary. "This was 6 feet from my daughter's bedroom door all night," she said, voice shaking with something colder than fear. "Do you understand that? I don't care what you've survived, or what your cousin did to you, or how many headlines have your name in them. I will not shelter a man in this house who brings a gun near my child." Draven's face went carefully neutral, but he didn't look away from her. "I will never point that weapon, or any weapon, at you or at her. That is not a promise I make lightly, and it is one I intend to keep. Promises are cheap. Then judge me by what I do, not what I say." He held her gaze, steady, unflinching, and something in the quality of his stillness made her believe it, against every instinct telling her not to. She was still glaring at the gun when her fingers, searching the lining of the coat out of some instinct to know exactly what else she'd let into her house, found a second object sewn into a hidden seam. Small, hard, wrapped in waterproofed plastic. She held it up. "And this?" Draven's expression changed entirely. "Give that to me. Not until you tell me what it is." He exhaled, and for a moment looked older than she'd first taken him for. A memory card. 10 years of ledgers. Every bribe, every payoff, every official on a payroll that shouldn't exist. Every shipment that moved through my ports that I didn't sanction and couldn't stop without exposing everything. And proof, dates, transfers, recordings, of exactly what Victor has been doing behind my back for the last 3 years to build the case that he should be the one running things instead of me. Why do you have this instead of it being locked in some vault? Because I was on my way to hand it to a federal contact the night Victor shot me. He knew. That's why he shot me on the lake road instead of anywhere else. Because I was already moving against him, and he moved first. Mara turned the small card over in her fingers, feeling the weight of it far exceed its size. A gun, a truth. 2 objects that summed up the man now recovering on her living room floor. One built for taking life, the other capable of ending an empire built on it. "I still want you out of my house the second you can stand on your own," she said. "But I understand now that it isn't that simple." "No," Draven agreed quietly. "It rarely is." By midday, the plows still hadn't reached the lake road, but cell service flickered weakly back to life, 1 bar at a time. Mara stood at the window with her phone in her hand, thumb hovering over the number for the county sheriff's office, and felt Roman Vale's eyes on her from across the room. "If you call them," Roman said evenly, "I would ask you to consider who answers." "Meaning what?" "Meaning Victor has spent 3 years buying loyalty in places that matter to him, local departments included. I am not telling you not to call. I am telling you that if the wrong person picks up that phone, you will have handed him a map directly to this cabin, with your daughter's name attached to it." Mara's stomach dropped. She thought of Ivy asleep upstairs, of the 3 puppies curled by the fire, of everything in this house that mattered more to her than any stranger's war. She lowered the phone. She turned to find Draven watching her from the couch, his color better than it had been that morning, but his breathing still careful around the stitches in his side. "You could still call," he said. "I would not stop you. If you believe it is the right thing to do, I will not spend what strength I have arguing you out of it. That's generous of you, considering it's your life on the line, too. It is not generosity. It is fact. This is your house, your daughter, your risk to weigh. I have no right to tell you how to weigh it." Mara set the phone down on the counter, hard enough that it rattled. "I am not helping you because I trust you," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I don't. I've known you less than a day, and half of what I know about you comes from a newspaper. I'm helping you because I still trust myself, because I know what kind of person I am, and I am not the kind of person who calls a number I'm not sure is safe and gambles with my daughter's life to save my own conscience. But hear me clearly, Mr. Draven. My daughter comes first. Above you. Above your war. Above whatever debt you think you owe me. The second I believe keeping you here costs her more than it's worth, you are gone, wound or no wound. Are we understood?" Something in Draven's face shifted, not softening exactly, but reordering, as if he were seeing her fully for the first time, weighing her not as a rescuer or a liability, but as an equal in whatever came next. "Understood," he said. "And for what it's worth, I would expect nothing less from you." It was Roman who found it, an hour later, turning Draven's watch over in gloved hands near the window light. "This casing," he said slowly, "it's been opened. Recently." Draven took it from him, examining the seam along the underside of the band, barely visible, the kind of work only someone who knew exactly where to look would notice. Victor gave me this watch for my birthday 2 years ago, he said, voice flat. I never once considered it might be more than sentiment. Mara leaned in despite herself. A tracker? A tracker, Roman confirmed. Low power, designed for intermittent bursts rather than constant signal, which is likely the only reason nobody's kicked in your door yet. The lake water may have damaged the transmitter further, but it's still sending something, and it just moved from the middle of a frozen lake to a fixed location on shore. The implication settled over the room like a held breath. He'll know you're alive, Mara said. He'll suspect it, Draven corrected. The signal is weak and irregular enough that he can't be certain. But he will send men to find out, and soon. We likely have until tonight before anyone searches the cabins around this lake seriously. Then destroy it, Mara said immediately. Smash it. Throw it in the fire. No. Draven's voice was final. If we destroy it, the signal stops entirely, and Victor will know instantly that it was found and disabled, which tells him I am not only alive but aware, and hunting him as much as he hunts me. Right now, he thinks he is stalking a wounded animal that doesn't know it's being tracked. A thin, cold edge crept into his voice, the first true glimpse Mara had seen of the man who had run an empire built on fear. Let him keep believing that. When he comes, he will not expect the prey to be waiting. Mara looked between the two men, one calculating a war, one guarding a door, and felt the full weight of what tonight would likely bring settle onto her narrow shoulders. Whatever else happened, one thing had become non-negotiable in her mind. The instant Roman said the word tracker. Her daughter would not be in this house when it came. She found Roman alone by the wood stove an hour before dusk. There's a woman 5 miles from here, she said, Esther Ward. She's known me since we moved to this county. She has a landline that still works half the time and a root cellar, and more common sense than anyone I know. I need you to take my daughter to her before dark and put her directly into Esther's hands, not drop her at the end of the driveway, into her hands. Roman studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. I'll bring her back to you the moment it's over. You have my word. Your word isn't worth much to me yet, Mara said, not unkindly, but it's the only currency on offer, so I'm taking it. She packed Ivy's bag herself. The inhaler first, always first, then a coat, a scarf, 2 changes of clothes, the small stuffed fox Ivy slept with every night since she was 3. When she woke her daughter from an afternoon nap, she kept her voice as light as she could make it. Hey, sleepyhead, how would you like to go visit Miss Esther? I hear she's got ginger cookies with your name on them. Ivy blinked up at her, still half in a dream. Are you coming? Something in Mara's chest cracked cleanly down the middle. Not right this second, baby. I've got some grown-up work to finish here first, but I'll come get you soon. I promise. What about the puppies? Ivy's small face creased with worry, already reaching for the nearest one. A black-furred bundle Mara had begun privately calling Ash. Are they coming too? The puppies are going to stay right here and help Mommy watch the house, Mara said, forcing a smile she didn't feel. They're going to be my little guard dogs while you're gone. Isn't that right? She scratched behind Ash's ear, and the puppy gave a soft, contented huff, oblivious to everything. Ivy considered this with the grave seriousness only a 6-year-old could bring to such news, then nodded, satisfied. Mara helped her into her coat, wrapped the scarf twice around her small neck, tucked the inhaler into the front pocket where she could always find it, and knelt to press her forehead against her daughter's. I love you more than anything in this whole world, she whispered. You know that, right? I know, Mommy. Ivy's arms went around her neck, small and warm and trusting in a way that made Mara want to weep. Love you too. She carried her daughter out to Roman's car herself, buckled her in, tucked the stuffed fox against her side, and stood in the driveway with her arms wrapped around her own body as the taillights disappeared into the falling snow. Only when the sound of the engine had faded entirely did she allow herself one long, shaking breath. Then she turned back toward the cabin, toward Draven, watching her from the doorway, with an expression that might have been respect, and something in her spine straightened. Now, she said, let's get ready to welcome our guests. Mara had lived on this land for 3 years. She knew every route that could trip an unwary foot, every patch of creek ice that never quite froze solid even in the coldest months, every angle from which the cabin's windows could be seen, and every angle from which they couldn't. Draven's men had power and weapons. Mara had geography, and geography, deployed correctly, was its own kind of weapon. You know this land better than anyone who might come here tonight, Draven observed, watching her move through the house with a speed that belied the exhaustion in her eyes. You should be giving the orders. I am giving the orders, Mara said, without looking up from the trap she was resetting near the edge of the tree line, an old coyote trap, rusted but functional, its jaws still strong enough to do serious damage to an ankle that didn't know it was there. You're wounded. You're going to sit down, conserve your strength, and do exactly what I tell you when I tell you. Understood? A faint, genuine smile touched Draven's mouth, the first she'd seen from him. Understood, Commander. She placed 3 more traps under fresh fallen snow along the most likely approach routes from the road, marking their positions in her own memory with a mental map only she carried. She set decoy oil lanterns burning in the old shed and the empty guest room, far from the actual windows where anyone inside would be, so that any shots fired at lit windows would strike empty rooms. Inside, she dragged the heavy oak table and 2 bookcases into positions that turned her open living room into a maze of blind corners and obstacles that only someone who'd memorized the layout could navigate cleanly in the dark. She kept the fire built high enough to distort the shadows thrown against the curtains, kept the puppies near the front door where their sharp ears would catch footsteps in the snow long before human ears could. When she finally handed Draven his gun back, she did it with a look that left no room for misunderstanding. You use this to protect, she said, not to punish, not for your war with your cousin. If it comes to that tonight, you use it to keep the people in this house breathing. That's the only reason I'm giving it back to you. He took it, weighed it once in his palm, and looked up at her with something that had shifted, over the course of one long day, into genuine regard. You have my word, he said, and this time, I intend for it to mean something. Mara nodded once, checked the loaded rifle that had been her father's, and settled into position by the window to watch the tree line as the last gray light bled out of the sky. The puppies growled first. It was a low, continuous sound unlike anything Mara had heard from them before. Not the sharp bark of alarm, but a steady rumbling warning. All 3 of them facing the same direction toward the tree line, ears pinned flat. They're coming, Mara breathed. Roman had returned 20 minutes earlier, confirming Ivy safely delivered into Esther's care before slipping back out into the dark to watch the eastern approach. Now, through the gap in the curtains, Mara saw them. 4 shapes moving low and fast between the pines, flashlights covered with red film to preserve their night vision, moving with the disciplined spacing of men who had done this before. They were heading straight for the decoy lanterns glowing in the shed and the empty guest room. Mara's pulse hammered, but her hands stayed steady on the rifle. She watched the lead man's foot come down exactly where she'd hoped it would, and the coyote trap snapped closed around his ankle with a metallic crack and a scream that tore through the quiet snowfall. His nearest companion spun toward him, momentarily exposed, and stepped straight through the thin ice covering the creek bed she'd deliberately left unmarked, plunging waist-deep into black freezing water with a shout of shock and fury. Mara fired once into the air above the tree line, not aiming to kill, only to sow confusion and confirm to the 2 remaining men that whatever was in this cabin was armed and watching. The shot cracked through the night air and the men scattered, dragging their injured companions back toward the tree line and, presumably, whatever vehicle had brought them. Draven, watching from beside the fireplace with his gun steady despite the strain visible in every line of his body, let out a breath. You bought us time. They'll come back smarter, Mara said, already reloading, her eyes never leaving the dark tree line. That was the easy part. They returned an hour later, and this time there was no careless charge toward decoy light. Mara heard the change in the puppy's growls the moment it began, quieter now, more controlled, matching the caution of men who had learned respect for the ground beneath them. She extinguished the last lamp, plunging the cabin into near-total darkness except for the low red glow of the banked fire, and positioned herself behind the overturned bookcase she'd angled specifically for this. The door gave way not with a crash but with a controlled shove, 2 men moving through fast and low. The first tripped exactly where Mara had shifted the heavy oak table 3 feet from its usual place, sprawling hard across the floor with a curse. Draven, moving faster than his wound should have allowed, closed the distance and disarmed him in one brutal, economical motion honed by years of violence Mara chose not to think too hard about in the moment. The second man swung his weapon toward Draven's exposed back, and Mara, without thinking, purely on instinct, hurled the still warm oil lamp from the mantel directly into his line of sight. It shattered against his shoulder, oil and glass and momentary chaos to throwing his aim wide, the shot burying itself harmlessly in the ceiling beam instead of Draven's spine. A third man Mara hadn't accounted for came through the kitchen door and grabbed her from behind before she could turn, an arm like iron locking around her throat. She fought, elbow into ribs, heel into shin, every dirty trick she'd ever half-learned in a self-defense class a decade ago. But he was simply stronger, dragging her backward, her vision beginning to gray at the edges as his grip tightened. Then Roman was there, materializing from the dark hallway like something summoned, driving the man off her with brutal precision and pinning him face down against the floorboards with a knee between his shoulder blades. "Get him behind cover," Roman ordered, jerking his chin toward Draven, who had gone pale and unsteady against the exertion, one hand pressed hard to his reopened wound. For one suspended moment, gasping air back into her bruised throat, Mara let herself believe they might actually survive this. Then the front door opened one final time, slow and unhurried, and a man stepped through it with the calm, unbothered ease of someone who had never once doubted he would walk out again. Victor Draven was younger than Mara expected, and somehow that made him more frightening. A face that might have been handsome if it weren't for the flat, patient cruelty behind his eyes. He surveyed the wreckage of the living room, the disarmed men groaning on the floor, his cousin bleeding and upright against the mantel, without a flicker of surprise. "You survived the lake," he said almost fondly. "I should have known. You always were harder to kill than you looked. You raised the gun to a cousin who fed you at his own table for 15 years, Victor," Nikolai said, voice rough but steady. "Let's not pretend either of us is surprised by anything tonight." Victor's gaze slid past him to Mara, standing rigid by the fireplace, and something colder settled into his expression. "And this is the nurse who pulled you out. How touching, how inconvenient." He raised the gun in his hand, unhurried, almost bored. "You understand, of course, that she's seen my face, heard my name. Old law, cousin. You taught it to me yourself, before you decided to grow a conscience. No witnesses, blood answers blood." "Let her go," Nikolai said, and for the first time that night his voice cracked with something raw and unguarded. "This is between us. It was always only ever between us. She has nothing to do with what you and I are. She has everything to do with it now." Victor's finger tightened on the trigger, the barrel swinging toward Mara with terrible finality. "That's the price of kindness, Nikolai. I thought the lake would have taught you that." Mara had 1/2 second to understand what was about to happen, and no time at all to move. Nikolai moved for her. He threw himself across the space between them with everything his wounded body had left, and the shot that Victor fired meant for Mara's chest tore instead through Nikolai's shoulder as he shielded her, the impact driving them both to the floor in a tangle of blood and snow-wet fabric. "No." Mara's scream tore out of her raw throat as she scrambled up beside him, hands already pressing hard against the fresh wound, blood welling dark and immediate between her fingers. No, stay with me, Nikolai, don't you dare." Above them, chaos erupted. Roman surging up from where he'd pinned the third attacker, driving into Victor before he could fire again, the two men grappling and crashing into the overturned furniture while the other men, disarmed and outnumbered, made no move to intervene. Nikolai's hand found Mara's wrist, weak but insistent, his eyes finding hers through a haze of pain and fading focus. "You saved me without needing a reason," he whispered, blood at the corner of his mouth. "I wanted, just once, to do one right thing, without counting what it cost me." "You're not dying on my floor," Mara said fiercely, pressing harder, forcing back tears she didn't have time for. "Do you hear me? I did not stitch you back together twice just to lose you now. Stay with me." Roman had Victor pinned face down against the ruined floorboards within a minute, one knee driven hard into his spine, a blade at his throat close enough to draw a thin red line. His voice, when he spoke, had none of its usual calm control. "Say the word," Roman said, not looking away from Victor's furious, straining face. "One word, and this ends the old way, the way it should have ended the night he put a bullet in you." Nikolai, gray-faced and barely conscious against Mara's supporting arm, managed to lift his head. "No, Nikolai, I said no." His voice found some last reserve of strength, hard and clear even through the blood loss. "I am done answering blood with blood, Roman. I have spent my entire life believing that was the only law that mattered, and it has cost me my sister, my peace, and very nearly this woman's life tonight because I let it define me for 38 years. I am done." Victor laughed under Roman's blade, a broken, disbelieving sound. "You'll let me live? After this? I am not doing this for you." Nikolai's eyes, when they found his cousin's, held nothing but exhaustion and a grief too old to be simple anger anymore. I am doing this because I finally understand the difference between justice and revenge, and I would like, for whatever time I have left, to be a man who chose the former." He turned his head weakly toward Roman. "The memory card. Give it to federal authorities, not local police. Victor's bought half of them, and God knows how deep that reaches. Federal. Directly. All of it. Every ledger, every name, every payment. His crimes, and mine. All of it, Roman. No more selective truth. Nikolai, that will end you too." "Then let it end me honestly," Nikolai said, "instead of leaving me to rot as a lie that keeps hurting people who never asked to be part of it." Mara, still pressing both hands hard against the wound at his shoulder, felt something in her chest ache with a feeling too complicated to name. Grief and awe, and something achingly close to tenderness for a man who, 24 hours ago, had been nothing but a stranger's hand slapping weakly against sinking glass. This is his redemption, she thought. Not surviving tonight, choosing this. The federal agents arrived with the dawn, summoned by Roman's call the moment Victor was secured, and the memory card's contents began transmitting to a contact Nikolai had trusted with his life for over a decade. Mara stood in her ruined living room, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of smoke and blood, and watched as Victor Draven was led out in handcuffs, his composure finally, completely gone, screaming accusations that nobody in the room bothered to answer. Nikolai was carried out on a stretcher, stable but weak, oxygen mask fogging with each labored breath. Before the paramedics closed the ambulance doors, he found Mara's eyes across the churned, bloody snow of her front yard, and something passed between them that neither one tried to put into words. Gratitude. Regret, the unfinished shape of something that had barely begun. The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow unraveling of everything that had once seemed permanently broken. The evidence on that small waterproof card proved devastating and far-reaching. Federal indictments followed within a month. Dozens of officials, 3 judges, a network of bribery that had protected Victor Draven's operations for the better part of a decade, and, tangled improbably in the same web, the very hospital administration in Chicago that had once buried Mara's whistleblower complaint. It turned out that corruption, once you pulled hard enough on one thread, tended to unravel connections nobody expected. Her old case was reopened. A journalist who'd been quietly investigating hospital malpractice cover-ups for years reached out. And this time, with federal attention already turned toward corrupt institutional protections, her testimony finally found an audience willing to listen. There was talk, cautious, unofficial, but real, of restoring her nursing license. The foreclosure notice that had haunted her kitchen drawer for months disappeared into a whistleblower compensation settlement that arrived not from any criminal empire, but from the very institutions that had wronged her in the first place, forced finally to account for what they'd buried. Her cabin, against every fear she'd carried through that long winter, was saved on terms she could actually be proud of. Ivy kept the puppies, of course. Ash, Snow, and Ember grew fat and loud and utterly devoted to the small girl who fed them scraps under the kitchen table when she thought her mother wasn't looking. Mara always was. Nikolai Draven did not disappear entirely into the machinery of federal cooperation, though the road ahead of him was neither short nor free of consequence. There were hearings, concessions, a negotiated agreement that acknowledged both what he had exposed and what he still owed for the years before he'd chosen differently. He was not, and would likely never again be, a free man in the way he once understood freedom. But he was, for the first time since he was a frightened boy, watching his sister die in a hospital that refused to see her, no longer hiding behind blood law to survive. He came back to Black Pine Lake in early spring, when the ice had finally broken and the water beneath it ran dark and clean again. He stood in Mara's driveway a long moment before he worked up whatever courage it took to knock, and when she opened the door, he looked at her the way a man looks at something he is no longer certain he has any right to. "You reminded me I still had a soul," he said quietly. "I came back to ask if I may protect yours without ever owning it." Mara didn't answer right away. She looked at him for a long moment, the man who had once been a stranger's hand against sinking glass, now standing on her porch with nothing to offer her but the truth of who he'd chosen to become. And she did not fall into his arms the way a different kind of story might have written it. But she opened the door wider. The puppies reached him first, 3 grown, clumsy bodies hurling themselves against his legs with delighted abandon. Ivy came next, small and bright-eyed, already asking whether he wanted to see the fort she'd built by the lake. Mara stood in her own doorway in the house that was finally truly hers again and let him step inside. Mara Ellison had once lost everything because she refused to turn away from a life that needed saving. On a frozen lake in Maine, the world tested her again. She saved 3 puppies, a wounded man, and perhaps the last human part of a mafia king. Nikolai Draven had lived by blood, fear, and debt. But in Mara's cabin, beside a child with fragile lungs and 3 tiny guardians by the fire, he learned that some debts cannot be paid with money or revenge. Some debts can only be honored by becoming worthy of the life someone gave back to you. Would you have saved Nikolai after discovering who he really was? And did he deserve redemption after choosing truth over revenge? Comment your answer below. If you love emotional mafia romance, single mom courage, rescue stories, and found family endings, hit like, share this story, and subscribe for more powerful cinematic dramas.